The kitchen at Rosewood Plantation was a cathedral of heat and steam, where cast iron ruled and prayers went unanswered. It was June in Louisa County, Virginia, and the air hung thick as molasses, clinging to skin like a second layer of suffering. Inside those brick walls, where the massive hearth never truly cooled, Hannah moved like a ghost among the living, silent, efficient, invisible. She had worked in that kitchen for 17 years, 17 summers of blistering heat. 17 winters where the cold still couldn't compete with the fire's constant hunger. Her hands, once smooth as river stones, were now mapped with burns and scars, each one a memory she couldn't afford to keep. Outside, beyond the kitchen's small window, Rosewood spread across 300 acres of rolling Virginia countryside. The main house stood like a white monument to wealth built on broken backs, its columns gleaming in the morning sun, its windows reflecting a world that existed only for those who lived inside. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Behind it, 23 cabins housed the 68 souls who made that world possible. Hannah knew every one of them by name, by story, by the particular way grief had marked their faces. But it was her own daughter's face she saw most clearly. Mercy was 12 years old, small for her age, with eyes that still held something the plantation hadn't managed to crush. She worked in the main house now, learning to serve the family that owned her future, her present, and every moment in between. Hannah had tried to prepare her, had whispered warnings in the dark of their cabin, had taught her to make herself small, invisible, to survive by becoming nothing. It hadn't been enough. The day it happened, Hannah was preparing the midday meal. Mistress Evelyn Harrow had guests coming from Richmond, the Caldwell family, plantation owners from 2 counties over, people who measured their worth in human property and spoke of it over tea like discussing the weather. The menu was ambitious: roasted duck with cherry glaze, scalloped potatoes, fresh bread, 3 kinds of preserves, and a cake that required 12 eggs and Hannah's entire morning. The kitchen buzzed with controlled chaos. Beside Hannah, old Ruth kneaded dough, with hands twisted by arthritis, but still capable of miracles. Near the hearth, Samuel stirred a pot of soup, his scarred forearm testament to a punishment from years ago that everyone remembered and no one spoke about. And moving between them all, carrying serving dishes from storage, was Mercy. The porcelain dish was older than Hannah herself. French, Mistress Harrow always said, brought over by her grandmother, worth more than any slave on the property. It was decorated with hand-painted roses, delicate as the woman who owned it was cruel, and it had survived an ocean voyage only to shatter on the kitchen floor of Rosewood Plantation. The sound was catastrophic in its simplicity: a crack, a crash. The musical tinkle of fragments scattering across brick. Everything stopped. Ruth's hands froze in the dough. Samuel's stirring ceased mid-motion. And Mercy stood in the center of spreading porcelain shards, her face transformed by a terror so pure it seemed to age her 10 years in an instant. "Mama," she whispered, the word breaking like the dish itself. Hannah moved without thinking, pulling her daughter back from the ruins, feeling the small body trembling against her own. "It's all right, baby. It's all right. We'll clean it up. But the kitchen door had already swung open. Mistress Evelyn Harrow stood in the threshold, her silk morning gown the color of fresh cream, her blonde hair perfectly arranged despite the hour. She was 28 years old, beautiful in the way poisonous flowers are beautiful, and her blue eyes swept the scene with the cold efficiency of a hawk spotting prey. "What?" she said, her voice soft as cotton and just as ready to be picked. "Has happened here?" No one answered. No one dared. The mistress's gaze fell on the broken dish, then rose slowly to Mercy's terrified face. "You." Evelyn said, taking a step into the kitchen, her slippers crunching delicately on porcelain fragments. "That was my grandmother's serving dish. Do you understand what you've destroyed?" "Mistress, please," Hannah heard herself saying, stepping forward, placing herself between her daughter and judgment. "It was an accident. She didn't mean—" "I don't recall addressing you, Hannah." The words cut clean as a blade. "Step aside." Every instinct screamed at Hannah to refuse, to grab her daughter and run, to do something, anything. But there was nowhere to run on a plantation, nowhere in Virginia, nowhere in the entire South where a slave woman's defiance wouldn't end in blood. She stepped aside. Evelyn approached Mercy with measured steps, each one deliberate as a chess move. She circled the girl slowly, examining her like merchandise at market. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the terrible gentleness of someone who had never been denied anything in her life. "Do you know how many slaves we could buy with what that dish was worth? 3, maybe 4, if we weren't particular about condition." She let that sink in. "That means you, child, just destroyed the value of your entire family, your mother, your brother in the fields, and yourself." She paused. "How do you think we should handle that?" Mercy's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Mistress. I'm so sorry. I'll be more careful, I promise. Promises." Evelyn smiled, and Hannah felt her blood turn to ice water. "Promises are for people, dear, not property." She turned to Samuel, still frozen by the hearth. "Fetch my husband. Tell him I need the overseer sent to the whipping post. We have a lesson to teach." The world tilted. Hannah heard herself speaking, her voice sounding distant and strange. "No, please. Mistress, please. Take it out on me, please. She's just a child. She's—" "Precisely." Evelyn's eyes never left Mercy. "She's at the perfect age to learn, old enough to remember, young enough to be shaped." She looked at Hannah then, really looked at her, and in those blue eyes was something worse than cruelty. It was satisfaction. "You should thank me, Hannah. I'm making her useful. I'm teaching her the value of care. 20 lashes will ensure she never drops another dish." 20 lashes. For a 12-year-old girl. For an accident. Hannah's hands clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms hard enough to draw blood she couldn't afford to spill. Around her, the kitchen held its breath. Ruth had tears streaming silently down her weathered face. Samuel stared at the floor, his jaw working but no words coming out. And Mercy looked at her mother with eyes that asked a question Hannah couldn't answer. "Why can't you save me?" "Take her," Evelyn said to Samuel. "And someone clean up this mess. I have guests arriving in 3 hours, and I expect everything to be perfect. Am I understood?" "Yes, Mistress," they chorused, the words automatic as breathing. Samuel moved like a man walking through water, each step toward Mercy weighted with sorrow. He took her hand gently, the way you'd take a lamb to slaughter, trying to offer comfort where none existed. Mercy didn't resist. She had learned, as they all had, that resistance only made things worse. As they passed Hannah, mother and daughter's eyes met. In that moment something passed between them, not words, but understanding. Mercy's expression said, "I forgive you for not being able to stop this," and Hannah's said, "I will never forgive myself." Then they were gone, the kitchen door swinging shut behind them. Evelyn remained a moment longer, adjusting a pearl earring with perfect composure. "Hannah, when you've finished cleaning, I'll need bath water prepared for this evening. Hot, very hot. After entertaining the Caldwells, I'll want a long soak," she smiled. "You always prepare it just right." "Yes, Mistress." "Good." Evelyn glided toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Hannah? That cake needs to be exceptional. I'm in a generous mood today, but that can change." She left, trailing silk and the scent of French perfume, leaving behind only the echo of her words and the scattered pieces of her grandmother's dish. Hannah stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the broken porcelain. Each fragment caught the light differently, sharp edges gleaming like tiny knives. Ruth approached slowly, placing a worn hand on Hannah's shoulder. "Child," the old woman whispered, "You've got to let this go. You've got to—" "No," Hannah said softly. The word was simple, but it contained everything. Every year of silence, every swallowed scream, every moment of pretending to be less than human so that humans could pretend they weren't monsters. She knelt down, began picking up the pieces of the broken dish. Her hands moved automatically, gathering fragments, feeling their sharp edges bite into her fingers. Outside, she could hear the first crack of the whip, then the second. Then her daughter's scream, high and thin as a wire, pulled too tight. Ruth knelt beside her, helping gather the porcelain. Neither woman spoke. There were no words for what they were feeling, no language that could contain it. They just knelt there on the kitchen floor, collecting broken pieces, while outside the whipping continued. By the 20th lash, Hannah had counted every piece of the dish. By the time Mercy's screams had faded to whimpers, she had cut her hands on the porcelain 12 times, and by the time Samuel carried the girl back to their cabin, her back striped with blood, Hannah had made a decision that would change everything. That evening, as the sun set over Rosewood Plantation, painting the sky the color of old blood, Hannah prepared Mistress Evelyn's bathwater. She filled the copper kettle, hung it over the fire, and watched the water begin to heat. Steam rose in ghostly spirals, bubbles formed and burst, and inside Hannah something that had been sleeping for 17 years finally opened its eyes. The water boiled, and kept boiling, far beyond what was needed, far beyond what was requested, until it was hot enough to scald, to burn, to blind. Hannah lifted the kettle from the fire. Its weight was familiar in her hands. She had carried it 1,000 times before. But tonight, as she climbed the stairs to the mistress's bathing room, each step felt like walking toward something that had been waiting for her all along. Behind her, in a cabin by the fields, her daughter lay face down on a rough mattress, her back a testament to the price of broken porcelain. Ahead of her, behind an ornate door, Mistress Evelyn Harrow reclined in a bathtub filled with rosewater, her eyes closed, her face peaceful, utterly unaware that the woman approaching with steam curling around her wrists had finally had enough. Hannah's hand found the door handle. It turned easily. She stepped inside, the copper kettle heavy and hot in her grip. Evelyn didn't open her eyes, just waved one lazy hand in dismissal. "Set it by the tub, Hannah. I'll call if I need you." But Hannah didn't set it down. She moved closer, closer, the steam rising from the kettle mixed with the perfumed air. Her reflection rippled in the bathwater, distorted and strange. Evelyn opened her eyes. Just for a second, their gazes met. And in that second, the mistress saw something that made her mouth open to scream. The kettle tipped. Time slowed. The boiling water arced through the air, catching lamplight, turning to liquid fire. It struck Evelyn's face, her perfect face, her eyes, her skin. The scream that followed wasn't human. It was the sound of a world ending, of power dissolving, of everything falling apart. The bathwater turned crimson, porcelain cracked, and somewhere in the chaos, as men shouted and footsteps thundered up the stairs, Hannah set down the kettle, turned toward the window, and felt something close to peace for the first time in 17 years. By the time they burst through the door, she was already gone. The night air tasted of copper and coming rain when Thomas Harrow emerged from the main house, his face a mask of controlled fury. He was 43 years old, master of Rosewood Plantation, and in the span of 20 minutes, his world had been torn apart by a slave woman carrying a kettle of boiling water. Behind him, the house blazed with lamplight, every window illuminated as servants rushed through hallways in organized chaos. A doctor had been summoned from town. Though they all knew there was little he could do, the damage was done. Evelyn's screams had finally subsided into whimpers, morphine doing what prayer couldn't. Her face, her beautiful, cruel face, was destroyed. Her eyes, those cold blue eyes that had looked at human beings like livestock, would never see again, and Hannah had vanished like smoke. "Get every able man assembled," Thomas barked at his overseer, a thick-necked brute named Coleman, who had built his reputation on brutality. "I want the dogs. I want torches. I want every inch of this property searched. The woods, the river, the tobacco fields, everywhere." Coleman nodded, already moving, his heavy boots crushing the gravel path. Within minutes the plantation bell was ringing, its iron tongue summoning men from their cabins, from their brief moments of rest, back into service. Not the field slaves. They would be locked in for the night, prevented from helping or hiding Hannah. No, these were the overseers, the patrollers, the white men who made their living, enforcing the invisible chains that held this world together. 20 men gathered in the yard, their faces hard in the torchlight. The hounds arrived, 4 massive bloodhounds straining at their leashes, trained to track runaways through swamp and forest. They were led to the bathing room, allowed to smell Hannah's work dress that someone had found abandoned in a hallway. The dogs bayed and pulled, eager for the hunt. "She couldn't have gone far," Coleman announced to the assembled men. "Not on foot, not a woman alone. We'll have her by dawn." He looked at Thomas. "What are your orders when we find her?" Thomas's jaw worked. The law was clear. A slave who attacked a master faced execution. But the law also understood that property had value, and Hannah was worth $800 at market. Still, some things transcended economics. "Bring her back alive," he said finally. "I want her to stand trial. I want everyone in 3 counties to see what happens when—" His voice cracked, something human breaking through the armor of authority. "Just find her and bring her back." The search party divided into 4 groups, each taking a different direction. Coleman led the largest contingent toward the river, reasoning that Hannah would seek water to cover her trail. Another group headed for the deep woods to the east, where runaway slaves sometimes hid in caves and hollows. A third swept the tobacco fields, their torches bobbing like fireflies through the darkness. The 4th remained at the plantation, searching buildings and questioning slaves. Inside the quarters, fear spread faster than fire. Every slave knew what Hannah had done. Some had seen her walking through the yard toward the woods, her face calm as Sunday morning, her hands still red from burns. Others had only heard the screams, but they knew. News traveled through slave communities like water through cracked earth, seeping into every space, carried on whispers and significant looks. In the cabin she shared with her children, Mercy lay face down on her mattress, her back still raw from the whipping. Her younger brother Jacob sat beside her, pressing cool rags to her wounds, with the careful gentleness of an 8-year-old trying not to hurt what was already broken. Neither child spoke. What was there to say? Their mother had done the unthinkable, and now the world would extract its price. Outside they heard boots, voices, the aggressive questioning as overseers moved from cabin to cabin. Where would she go? Who would hide her? Speak up now and save yourselves trouble. But no one spoke. Even those who didn't approve of what Hannah had done, who thought her foolish or crazy or damned, kept their silence. There were lines you didn't cross, even on a plantation. You didn't help the masters, hunt your own. Coleman reached their cabin near midnight. He shoved the door open without knocking, and why would he? And his eyes swept the small space. 2 straw mattresses, a crude table, a few cooking implements, the smell of blood and fear. "Where's your mother?" he demanded, looking at Jacob. The boy stared at him with eyes too old for his face. "Don't know, sir." "Don't lie to me, boy." Coleman stepped closer, his bulk filling the tiny room. "She say anything before she left? Where she might run to?" "No, sir." Coleman's gaze shifted to Mercy, still lying prone. He nudged her with his boot, not gentle. "What about you, girl? Your mama just tried to kill the mistress. You want to protect her after that?" Mercy's voice came out muffled against the mattress. "She didn't say nothing to me, sir. I was here the whole time. I don't know where she went." It was the truth. Hannah hadn't said goodbye, hadn't explained or justified or prepared them. She had simply acted, and then she was gone, leaving her children to face whatever came next. Coleman studied them a moment longer, then spat on the floor. "Your mother's dead. You know that, right? When we find her, and we will find her, she'll hang, and you too will be sold. Master Harrow won't keep the family of a woman who—" He stopped himself, perhaps recognizing some limit even he wouldn't cross with children. "Just know it's all over for you." He left, his heavy footsteps fading into the night. Jacob waited until the sound was gone, then whispered, "You think Mama got away?" Mercy didn't answer. She couldn't. The pain in her back was nothing compared to the confusion in her heart. Her mother had saved her from future beatings, yes, but at what cost? And where could a black woman run in Virginia in 1842? There were no safe places, no refuge. The whole world was a plantation, just with different masters. Miles away, in the deep woods beyond Rosewood's eastern boundary, Hannah moved through darkness like she was born to it. She had discarded her house dress for clothes she'd hidden weeks ago, rough pants and a shirt stolen from the laundry, dark colors that drank the moonlight. Her hands still burned from the kettle, but the pain felt distant, unimportant. She had planned this. Not the specific moment, perhaps, but the possibility. For months, since Mercy had been assigned to the main house, Hannah had been preparing. She'd cached supplies in the woods during her rare free hours. Food wrapped in oilcloth and hidden in hollow trees. A knife taken from the kitchen and buried in a leather pouch. A map, crude but functional, showing the road north to Richmond and beyond. She knew the hunters would come, knew the dogs would follow. But she also knew something they didn't. She wasn't running blind. Old Ruth had told her stories, whispered in the kitchen during long afternoons, about the Underground Railroad. About safe houses and conductors and Quakers who helped runaways reach freedom. About a network that stretched from Virginia to Pennsylvania and beyond, invisible but real. "There's a place," Ruth had said months ago, her gnarled hands shaping dough, her voice barely audible. 3 miles north of here where the creek splits, big oak with a hollow. If someone was desperate enough, scared enough, they could leave a signal there, a white cloth. And if the right people saw it, if the stars aligned just so, help might come. Hannah had memorized every word, had walked past that oak tree on errands to town, had marked it in her mind. Now, in the darkness, she moved toward it with the focused determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. The forest was alive with night sounds. Owls called to each other in the canopy. Small creatures rustled through undergrowth. And somewhere behind her, growing closer, came the baying of hounds. They had her scent. Hannah increased her pace, using every trick she'd ever heard. She waded through a shallow stream, walking in the water for a quarter-mile before emerging on the opposite bank. She rubbed her clothes with pine needles and crushed herbs, trying to mask her smell. She backtracked twice, creating false trails that would waste the hunter's time. But the dogs were relentless, bred for this, trained to track human desperation through any terrain. By the time she reached the creek, where it split around a small island, the first hints of dawn were graying the eastern sky. The oak tree stood exactly where Ruth had described it, massive and ancient, its trunk thick enough to hide 3 men. Hannah approached it with her heart hammering, her burned hands shaking as she tied a strip of white cloth to a low branch. There. It was done. Now she could only wait and hope that someone would see, would understand, would help. But waiting meant being found. The baying of the hounds grew louder, closer. She could hear men's voices now, shouting coordinates to each other, crashing through brush with the confidence of those who had never been prey. Hannah looked at the oak tree, at her signal hanging limp in the still morning air, and made another decision. She climbed. The bark was rough under her hands, each grip sending fire through her burns. But she climbed anyway, moving from branch to branch, ascending into the oak's vast crown, where leaves grew thick enough to hide a desperate woman. She settled into a fork where 3 branches met, pressed herself flat against the trunk, and tried to slow her breathing. Below, the world grew bright. Sunrise painted the forest gold and amber. Birds began their morning songs, oblivious to human drama. And then the dogs arrived, a surging mass of muscle and teeth and single-minded purpose. They circled the oak tree, baying, leaping at its trunk, utterly convinced their quarry was near. Behind them came Coleman and 6 other men, their faces flushed with exertion and excitement. "She's here somewhere," Coleman panted, looking around. "Dogs don't lie. Check the hollow. Check behind it. Fan out." The men spread through the area, poking into bushes, examining the ground for tracks. One of them noticed the white cloth. "What's this?" He pulled it down, examined it. Clean, fresh. "She left this." Coleman studied the cloth, his brow furrowing. He was a brutal man, but not a stupid one. A white cloth in a hollow tree meant something. Signals, Underground Railroad, abolitionists. The word made him spit. "She's got help coming," he said. "Or thinks she does." He looked up suddenly, scanning the trees. "Or she's still here, hiding, waiting for that help." Hannah held her breath, pressed so tight against the bark she could feel every ridge. From her perch, she could see them clearly, could see Coleman's face turn upward, his eyes narrowing, could see him stare directly at the section of tree where she hid. For one eternal second, their eyes met through the leaves. Then Coleman smiled. "Hello, Hannah," he said softly. "Coming down on your own? Or do we need to smoke you out?" The other men gathered below, their faces upturned, their rifles ready. The dogs continued baying, sensing victory. And Hannah, trapped 50 feet above the ground with no escape and no hope, felt the fight drain out of her. She had known, from the moment she tipped that kettle, that this was how it would end. You couldn't strike at the masters and live. You couldn't burn their world without burning in return. But she had done it anyway, for mercy, for every slave child who'd been beaten for breaking porcelain, for 17 years of swallowed rage. "I'm coming," she called down, her voice steady. "Don't shoot." She began to descend, moving carefully, each handhold deliberate. The men watched in silence, weapons trained on her, ready for tricks. But Hannah had no tricks left. She climbed down to face whatever came next, her hands burning, her heart strangely light. When her feet touched the ground, Coleman grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her hands behind her back and binding them with rope. The other men surrounded her, creating a circle of judgment. "You really thought you'd escape?" Coleman asked, his breath hot on her face. "Where would you go, woman? You think there's any place in this world for someone like you who does what you did?" Hannah met his eyes without flinching. "Didn't do it to escape," she said quietly. "Did it because it needed doing." The slap came hard and fast, snapping her head to the side, but she didn't cry out, didn't give them the satisfaction. She just straightened up and stared at Coleman with eyes that held something he couldn't understand, and therefore feared. "Let's get her back," he muttered, disturbed by her calmness. "Master Harrow will decide what happens next." They marched her through the forest as the sun climbed higher, the dogs ranging ahead, the men forming a tight guard around their prisoner. Hannah walked in silence, her mind drifting to her children. Would they remember her as a monster, a hero, or just a mother who loved them enough to damn herself? By mid-morning, they emerged from the woods onto Rosewood's eastern fields. Slaves working in the tobacco stopped to watch the procession pass, their faces carefully blank, but their eyes speaking volumes. News of Hannah's capture would spread within minutes. By noon, every soul on the plantation would know. They locked her in the spring house, a stone building built half underground to keep food cool. It was dark, damp and cold, even in summer. Hannah sat on the dirt floor, her bound hands numb, and waited. She could hear voices outside, heated discussions about what should happen next. The law demanded a trial, even for slaves. But plantation justice often operated outside the law. A quick hanging, an example made. A warning to anyone else who might confuse themselves with human beings possessing rights. Hours passed. The light filtering through cracks in the door shifted, changed color, faded. Hannah dozed fitfully, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. In her dreams, she saw Mercy's face, saw the whip rising and falling, saw the copper kettle tipping in endless slow motion. She saw Evelyn's eyes, blue and cruel, transforming to ruined flesh. She saw it all and felt no regret. Near dusk, the door opened. Thomas Harrow stood silhouetted against the dying light, alone. He stared at Hannah for a long moment, this woman who had destroyed his wife's face, his family's peace, his sense of absolute control. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice cracking. "We fed you, clothed you, gave you work. Why?" Hannah looked at him from the floor, this man who thought owning other humans was a kindness, and almost laughed. But she was too tired. Too done with explaining the obvious to those who refused to see. "You had my daughter whipped," she said simply, 20 lashes for breaking a dish. "She needed to learn. She's 12 years old. She's property, she's—" Thomas stopped himself, perhaps hearing his own words. He was not a cruel man by the standards of his world. He didn't rape his slaves or beat them for entertainment. He provided adequate food and medical care. He even allowed them Sundays off. By the logic of 1842, Virginia, he was a good master. But Hannah's eyes told him what his conscience tried to whisper. There was no such thing as a good master. The very concept was obscene. "The trial is in 3 days," he said, recovering his authority. "In town, the judge will decide your fate, but Hannah—" He paused. "It's death. You know that. For what you did to Evelyn, there's no other outcome." "I know." "Then why? Why throw your life away? Why leave your children alone?" Hannah smiled, and it was not a happy expression. "My children aren't alone. They got each other. And they got something else now too." "What?" "They got the memory of their mother standing up, being more than what you made us. Maybe that's worth more than me living on my knees." Thomas stared at her, uncomprehending. Then he shook his head and turned away. "You're a fool, Hannah. A damn fool." "Yes, sir," she agreed, "but I'm a fool who can sleep at night." He left, locking the door behind him, leaving her in darkness. But it wasn't the absolute darkness of before. Through a crack in the wall, Hannah could see a single star appearing in the deepening blue sky. She watched it emerge, bright and distant and free, and thought of all the slaves who had navigated by stars, who had followed the drinking gourd north to freedom. She hadn't made it. But maybe someday her children would. Maybe her act of defiance would be a story they carried, a seed of resistance that would grow in ways she'd never see. In the main house, Evelyn Harrow lay in her bedroom, her head wrapped in bandages, her world reduced to pain and darkness. The morphine made her drift, made the hours blend together, but in her clearer moments she understood what had been taken from her. Not just sight, not just her face, but the certainty that she was untouchable, that the natural order would always protect her. A slave had looked at her and seen not a mistress, but a target, had chosen violence over submission, had destroyed the illusion that power was permanent, that the whip would always keep the whipped in their place. In the quarters, Mercy held Jacob through the night, both children lying awake, listening to hushed conversations around them. Their mother would hang, they would be sold. Everything they knew was ending. But Mercy's back, despite the pain, was healing, and in healing it was teaching her something her mother had tried to show her. Some scars were worth bearing. Some acts of defiance were worth any price. 3 days later, when they loaded Hannah onto a wagon to take her to trial in Louisa Courthouse, Mercy stood with the other slaves and watched her mother ride away. Hannah saw her daughter in the crowd, met her eyes one last time, and smiled. It was a smile that said, "I would do it again. I would burn the world for you. Remember that." And Mercy did remember. She would remember for the rest of her life. Louisa Courthouse was a modest building for a place where life and death were decided. Built of red brick and white trim, it sat at the center of the small town like a guardian of order. Its Greek revival columns an echo of power structures that stretched back across an ocean to ancient civilizations built on slavery. On the morning of June 15, 1842, every seat in its courtroom was filled. The trial of a slave was always a spectacle, but this one promised more. Word had spread through 3 counties about the slave woman who had blinded her mistress with boiling water. The crime was so audacious, so unthinkable, that people traveled for hours to witness justice dispensed. Plantation owners came to see the example made. Their wives came, clutching pearls and handkerchiefs, simultaneously horrified and fascinated. Even a few newspaper men from Richmond had made the journey, sensing a story that would sell papers. Hannah sat in the defendant's area, a wooden bench against the wall, separated from the white spectators by an informal but absolute boundary. She wore a simple dress provided by the court, her hands unbound for the first time in days, though 2 armed guards flanked her. Her burned palms had been bandaged, but improperly, and she could feel infection beginning to set in. It didn't matter. Dead women didn't need healthy hands. She looked around the courtroom with calm curiosity, like a traveler observing a foreign land. The judge's bench sat elevated, emphasizing the authority of the white man who would soon occupy it. The jury box held 12 white men, all property owners, all with a vested interest in maintaining the social order that Hannah had disrupted. There was no defense attorney. Slaves weren't entitled to legal representation in Virginia. They were allowed to speak, to plead, but the law viewed them less as defendants and more as talking property awaiting valuation and disposal. The prosecutor was a thin man named Aldridge Pemberton, known throughout the county for his zealous prosecution of any crime that threatened the plantation system. He'd sent 5 slaves to the gallows in the past 3 years, each time delivering passionate speeches about civilization and the necessity of firm control over an inferior race. He arranged his papers on the prosecution table with the precise movements of someone who had done this many times before. At 9 o'clock, a bailiff called the court to order. All rise for the Honorable Judge Cornelius Whitmore. The white spectators stood. Hannah remained seated until one of her guards prodded her shoulder. She rose slowly, her eyes fixed on the judge as he entered through a side door. Whitmore was 67 years old, a Virginia native who had practiced law before the Revolution and seen the young nation grow into its contradictions. He owned 12 slaves himself, worked them on a modest farm outside town. He considered himself fair-minded, educated, a man of reason. He took his seat, arranged his robes, and surveyed the packed courtroom with satisfaction. This would be an important trial, a reaffirmation of principles, a teaching moment. "Be seated," he commanded, and the room rustled with the sound of compliance. The bailiff called the case. The Commonwealth of Virginia versus Hannah, slave property of Thomas Harrow, charged with malicious wounding and attempted murder. Attempted murder. Hannah almost smiled at that. There had been nothing attempted about it. Evelyn Harrow's eyes were gone, destroyed beyond any doctor's ability to repair. If that wasn't successful murder of her sight, what was? Judge Whitmore looked at Hannah directly. "The defendant will stand." She stood, meeting his gaze without the downcast eyes that were expected. Several spectators gasped at her boldness. Even her guard shifted uncomfortably. "Do you understand the charges against you?" Whitmore asked. "Yes, sir," Hannah replied, her voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "And do you understand that this court will determine whether you acted with malicious intent to harm your mistress? And if so, what punishment befits your crime?" "I understand." Whitmore paused, studying her. In his decades on the bench, he'd seen many slaves stand trial. Most were terrified, broken things, eyes downcast, voices trembling. This woman was different. She stood straight-backed and clear-eyed, as if she were observing proceedings rather than being judged by them. "Very well. Mr. Pemberton, you may present your case." The prosecutor rose, buttoning his coat with a theatrical flourish. He was in his element, performing for the crowd, reinforcing the social order with every word. Gentlemen of the jury, what we have before us today is not merely a crime, but an attack on the very foundation of our society. His voice filled the courtroom, practiced and powerful. On the evening of June 11th, the defendant, a slave named Hannah, entered the bathing chamber of her mistress, Mrs. Evelyn Harrow, carrying a kettle of boiling water. Mrs. Harrow, resting after a long day of entertaining guests, was entirely vulnerable, defenseless. And in an act of barbarism that should chill every civilized heart, this defendant deliberately poured that boiling water onto her mistress's face, destroying her vision and scarring her permanently. He paused, letting the words sink in, watching the jury's faces harden with appropriate outrage. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of carelessness or a tragic mishap. This was cold-blooded, premeditated violence. The defendant had been ordered to prepare bathwater. She could have prepared it at a reasonable temperature. Instead, she let it boil, gentlemen, until it was hot enough to cause maximum damage. She carried it to her mistress's private chambers. She approached that bathtub, and she poured. Several women in the gallery dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs. The men's faces were stone, their judgment already formed. I will prove to you beyond any doubt that this slave committed this heinous act with full knowledge and intent. I will show you that she represents everything we fear when we speak of the necessity of control, of firm but fair discipline, of maintaining the natural order that God himself ordained when he created the races and set each in their proper place. Hannah listened without expression. The prosecutor's words washed over her like rain over stone. He was telling a story, but it wasn't her story. In his version, she was a monster who had attacked without provocation, a savage who had turned on the generous hand that fed her. There was no mention of mercy. No mention of 20 lashes, no mention of 17 years of accumulated grief. I call my first witness, Pemberton announced. Thomas Harrow, master of Rosewood Plantation. Thomas entered from a side room, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. He took the witness stand, placed his hand on a Bible, and swore to tell the truth. He wore his finest suit, black wool despite the summer heat, and his collar was so white it seemed to glow. Pemberton approached him with the sympathetic manner of one gentleman addressing another's tragedy. Mr. Harrow, please tell the court about the events of June 11th. Thomas cleared his throat. I was in my study, going over the plantation accounts, when I heard screaming. Not regular screaming, something terrible. I ran upstairs and found... His voice broke convincingly. I found my wife in her bathtub, the water red, her face... God help me, her face was... He covered his eyes with one hand. Take your time, sir, Pemberton said gently. After a moment, Thomas continued. The bath water had been poured over her face and shoulders. Her skin was burned terribly, and her eyes, the doctor said later that her eyes were beyond saving. The heat had... He swallowed hard. My wife will never see again. And where was the defendant when you arrived? Gone. Vanished. We found the kettle on the floor, still hot. The window was open. She had run. Did you consider this behavior consistent with innocence or guilt? Objection. The voice came not from a lawyer, but from Hannah herself, still seated on her bench, every head turned. I got no lawyer to object for me, so I'm doing it myself. That's not a fair question. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel. The defendant will remain silent unless given permission to speak. Then give me permission, Hannah said calmly, because that prosecutor is telling half-truths and calling them whole. Whitmore's face flushed red. In 30 years on the bench, no slave had ever interrupted proceedings like this. You will have your opportunity to speak when I say so. Until then, you will remain silent or I will have you gagged. Do you understand? Hannah held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded. Yes, sir. The judge turned to Pemberton. Continue. But something had shifted in the room. The spectators leaned forward, suddenly more interested. This was not going to be a routine trial after all. Pemberton questioned Thomas for another 20 minutes, establishing the facts of the attack, the severity of Evelyn's injuries, the value of the property destroyed, meaning Hannah herself, worth $800 before the attack, now essentially worthless. Then he called his second witness, Dr. Nathaniel Pierce, the physician who had treated Evelyn. Dr. Pierce was a scholarly man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the weary manner of someone who had seen too much suffering. He described Evelyn's injuries in clinical detail, second- and third-degree burns covering her face, neck, and upper chest, permanent blindness in both eyes, scarring that no amount of medical skill could heal. The jury listened with grim faces, their sympathy entirely with the injured mistress. "In your medical opinion," Pemberton asked, "was this injury consistent with an accident or with deliberate intent to harm?" Dr. Pierce adjusted his spectacles. "The pattern of the burns suggests the water was thrown or poured deliberately. An accidental spill would show a different distribution. This was concentrated, intentional." "Thank you, Doctor." The prosecution rested. Pemberton sat down with the satisfied air of a job well done. The case was clear, the evidence damning, the outcome certain. Judge Whitmore looked at Hannah. "The defendant may now speak in her defense, if she has anything to say." Hannah stood, every eye in the courtroom fixed on her. She could feel the weight of their judgment, their fear, their need to see her destroyed so they could sleep safely in their beds, secure in the knowledge that their slaves would never dare what she had dared. "May I ask questions?" she said to the judge. Whitmore frowned. "You may address the court, yes. Whether I allow questions depends on their relevance. I'd like to question Mr. Harrow again." This was unprecedented. The jury shifted in their seats. Pemberton half rose in objection, then sat back down, curious to see what would happen. "I'll allow it," Whitmore said after a pause, "but make it brief." Thomas returned to the witness stand, his expression wary. Hannah approached him slowly, her bandaged hands clasped in front of her. "Mr. Harrow, sir, do you remember the morning of June 11th before the bath?" Yes, generally." "Do you remember your wife ordering my daughter whipped?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "That's not relevant to—" "Answer the question," Hannah said quietly. "Do you remember? Your daughter broke valuable property. She was disciplined. That's how a plantation functions. She's 12 years old, 20 lashes. For dropping a dish she didn't mean to drop." Hannah's voice remained calm, but something in it made the room grow quieter. "You remember standing on your porch, watching the overseer whip my child until her back bled. You remember that?" "I was not on the porch, and discipline is necessary for—" "You heard the screaming, though. Everyone heard it. 20 lashes makes a lot of noise when it's a child screaming." Pemberton stood. "Your Honor, this line of questioning is irrelevant to the charge of assault." "I disagree," Hannah said, before the judge could respond. "It's very relevant. You want to know why I did what I did? You want to understand the mind of the monster who hurt poor Mrs. Harrow?" She turned to face the jury, speaking directly to them. "Then you need to understand what happened before. You need to know about my daughter's back. About 17 years of carrying kettles and biting my tongue and watching my children grow up as property. You need to know all of it, or you're not judging what actually happened. You're just telling yourself a story that lets you sleep at night." "That's enough!" Whitmore banged his gavel. "You are here to defend yourself, not to lecture this court on—" "On what? On truth." Hannah's voice rose for the first time, passion breaking through her calm. "I did it. I'm not denying that. I carried that kettle upstairs, and I poured it on Mistress Harrow's face, and I'd do it again if I had the chance. Because she had my baby whipped, because she looked at my child bleeding and smiled, because in 17 years I tried everything else. I was quiet, I was obedient, I was the perfect slave, and it didn't matter, it was never going to matter. So yes, I hurt her. I took her eyes because she couldn't see my daughter as human anyway. The courtroom exploded. Spectators shouted in outrage. The judge hammered his gavel repeatedly. The guards grabbed Hannah's arms, ready to drag her back to her seat, but she wasn't finished. "You want to hang me? Fine. I expected that. But don't pretend this is justice. Don't call this a trial. This is just you protecting your own and making sure the rest of us remember our place. Well, I forgot my place, and maybe that's worth dying for. Maybe my daughter will remember that her mother forgot to be a slave for one day. Maybe that's enough." They pulled her back to her bench, the guards gripping her arms hard enough to bruise. The courtroom was in chaos, voices overlapping, emotions running high. Some spectators looked angry, righteous in their fury, but others, just a few, looked uncomfortable, as if Hannah's words had found some crack in their certainty. Judge Whitmore restored order with difficulty. When the room finally quieted, he looked at Hannah with something approaching respect, though he would never admit it. "You have said your piece," he told her. "The jury will now deliberate." The 12 white men filed out to a back room. They were gone for 17 minutes. Later, some would say they took that long only for appearance's sake, that the verdict had been decided before they left their seats. Others insisted that there was genuine debate, that 1 or 2 jurors felt troubled by what they'd heard. Either way, when they returned, their foreman stood and delivered the verdict in a clear, firm voice. Guilty on all charges. No one was surprised. Hannah nodded once, accepting it. Judge Whitmore addressed her formally. "Hannah, slave property of Thomas Harrow, you have been found guilty of malicious wounding and attempted murder. The sentence for such crimes, when committed by a slave against a master or mistress, is death by hanging. The execution will be carried out 3 days hence, at noon, in the public square. May God have mercy on your soul." Hannah stood. "He might," she said softly, "but I doubt you will." They led her out through a side door as the spectators buzzed with conversation, already turning her story into legend, into warning, into whatever narrative suited their needs. Outside, a wagon waited to take her back to Louisa County Jail, where she would spend her final 3 days. As they loaded her into the wagon, Hannah looked up at the sky. It was afternoon now, the sun high and merciless. She thought about Mercy and Jacob, wondered if someone had told them the verdict, hoped they would survive what came next. The wagon lurched forward. Behind her, the courthouse receded, that temple of law and order, built on the assumption that some lives mattered more than others. Ahead lay 3 more sunrises, 3 more chances to feel the world on her skin before they took it all away. Hannah closed her eyes and tried not to think about the rope. The Louisa County Jail was a stone building that smelled of despair and human waste. It held 4 cells, but Hannah occupied one alone, not out of kindness, but because they feared her influence on other prisoners. A slave who had struck at her mistress was like a disease that might spread through whispered conversations and shared grievances. Her cell was 8 feet by 6 feet, with a straw mattress thin as paper and a bucket for waste that hadn't been emptied in days. A small barred window high on the wall let in light, but offered no view except a square of sky. It was through this window that Hannah marked the passage of her final days, watching clouds drift past like ships sailing to places she would never see. The first day after the trial, she slept. Exhaustion claimed her completely, pulling her down into darkness where dreams mixed with memories in ways she couldn't untangle. She saw Mercy as a baby, felt the weight of her in her arms, remembered thinking that surely she could protect this child from the worst of plantation life. She saw herself younger, just arrived at Rosewood, still believing that if she worked hard enough, kept her head down enough, she might carve out some small pocket of safety. She had been so naive. On the second day, they brought her a visitor. The jailer unlocked her cell with a screech of rusty hinges and announced, "You got 10 minutes, no touching." Hannah sat up on her mattress, squinting against the sudden brightness from the hallway lamp. A figure entered the cell, and it took her a moment to recognize Ruth, the old woman from Rosewood's kitchen. Ruth was 73 years old, born into slavery and bearing its marks in every line of her weathered face. Her hands, twisted with arthritis, carried a cloth bundle that she set down carefully before settling herself on the stone floor across from Hannah. "Child," Ruth said softly, her voice cracking with emotion. "Oh, child." They sat in silence for a moment. Two women who had spent years working side by side, sharing the small intimacies of kitchen labor, the rhythm of kneading bread, the careful stirring of soups, the whispered conversations that happened only when no white faces were watching. "How'd you get permission to come?" Hannah asked. "Told Master Harrow I needed to come pray with you. Save your soul before—" Ruth's voice trailed off. Neither of them needed to say it. Before the hanging. Before the rope. Before the final demonstration of power that would remind every slave in Virginia what happened when you forgot your place. "That's kind of you," Hannah said, though they both knew Ruth hadn't come to pray. Ruth unwrapped her cloth bundle, revealing a piece of cornbread, some dried fruit, and a small jar of honey. "They feeding you?" "Some. Not much." Hannah accepted the cornbread gratefully, tearing off a piece and chewing slowly. It was still warm, and the taste of it, the simple goodness of food prepared with care, made her eyes sting with unshed tears. "How are my children?" Ruth's expression clouded. "Alive. Mercy's back is healing, though she'll carry them scars forever. Jacob's quiet, quieter than before. She hesitated. Master Harrow's decided to sell them. Says he can't keep the family of a woman who, well, he's got buyers coming from Richmond next week." Hannah closed her eyes, absorbing this. She'd known it was likely, but hearing it confirmed was different. Her children would be torn from the only home they'd known, separated probably, sold to different plantations. Mercy was 12, strong, a good house slave. She'd fetch a decent price. Jacob at 8 was less valuable, still years away from peak working age. They might sell him cheap, might separate him from his sister forever. "I did this to them," Hannah whispered. "No." Ruth's voice came sharp and firm. "Don't you carry that. You did what any mother would do if she had the courage. What happened to Mercy, that whipping, that was evil, pure evil. You responded to evil the only way a powerless woman could. That's not on you, that's on them. Mercy might not see it that way. She might hate me for leaving her alone. She's 12 years old, Hannah. She don't understand yet. But she will. Give her time, give her years, and she'll understand what you did. She'll understand that you showed her she was worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. That's a gift, even if it don't feel like one right now." Hannah wanted to believe that. Wanted to imagine a future where her daughter looked back and felt pride instead of abandonment. But the reality pressed in. The cold stone floor, the smell of the cell, the knowledge that in 2 days she would walk up wooden steps to a platform where a noose waited. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. Ruth reached out, and despite the jailer's warning about touching, she took Hannah's hand in both of hers. The old woman's skin was dry and warm, familiar as home. "Course you're scared. That's human. That's real. But you listen to me now." Ruth leaned closer, her cloudy eyes fixed on Hannah's. "They can take your body. They can string you up and make a show of it. But they can't take what you did. They can't undo the fact that you stood up. You're going to die, yes, but you're going to die as yourself, not as the thing they tried to make you. Does that matter? When I'm dead, I'm dead. It matters to everyone watching. It matters to every slave who hears your story. You think word of this ain't spreading? You think people from here to the Carolina coast ain't hearing about the woman who blinded her mistress? Stories like yours. They live on, Hannah. They become something bigger than the person who lived them." Hannah thought about that. Somewhere in Virginia, Mississippi, Georgia, were women like her carrying kettles, biting their tongues, watching their children grow up as property. Would they hear about Hannah? Would it change anything? Probably not. The world would keep turning. Slavery would continue. But maybe, just maybe, one woman somewhere would remember that resistance was possible, that silence wasn't the only option. The children, Hannah said, when they're sold, is there any way to keep them together? Ruth's face fell. I'll try, baby. I'll talk to Master Harrow, see if there's any buyer willing to take both. But you know how it is. Brothers and sisters, mothers and children, they don't care about keeping families whole. It's cheaper to split them up. Hannah nodded. She'd known the answer before asking. Just tell them I loved them. Tell them everything I did was because I loved them too much to watch them break. I will. I promise you that. The jailer appeared at the cell door, jangling his keys. Time's up. Ruth struggled to her feet, her arthritic joints protesting. She looked down at Hannah one last time, memorizing her face. You rest now. You eat that food. And you remember, you're more than what they made you. You always were. Then she was gone, her shuffling footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving Hannah alone with her thoughts and the slowly darkening square of sky visible through the high window. That night, Hannah couldn't sleep. She lay on the thin mattress, feeling the cold seep up through stone floor, and thought about her life. 35 years, most of them spent in service to people who saw her as livestock. She thought about the children she'd borne, Mercy and Jacob, yes, but also 2 others who hadn't survived infancy, taken by fever and the inadequate medical care afforded to slave children. She thought about the thousands of meals she'd cooked, the endless loads of laundry, the floors scrubbed, the orders followed, the daily surrender of self that slavery demanded. And she thought about that moment in Evelyn's bathing room, the weight of the kettle in her hands, the choice spreading before her like a river forking, the knowledge that tipping that kettle would end everything she knew. She had done it anyway. In the cell's darkness, Hannah smiled. On the 3rd day, a minister came. Reverend Silas Cotton was a portly man with kind eyes who genuinely believed in the salvation of souls. Even slave souls. He sat outside her cell. The jailer wouldn't let him inside, concerned about safety, and read from his Bible in a sonorous voice. The Lord is my shepherd, he intoned. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. Hannah listened politely. She'd heard these words before, countless times, usually from white ministers who came to plantation chapels to preach about obedience, about Paul's letter to the Ephesians, about slaves obeying their masters as they would obey Christ. The Bible, in the hands of slaveholders, became a cudgel to enforce submission. But Reverend Cotton was different. When he finished the psalm, he looked at Hannah with genuine compassion. I know you're frightened, he said. Anyone facing death would be. But I want you to know that God sees you. He sees your pain. He knows why you did what you did. Does he approve? Hannah asked, curious what this white minister would say. Cotton paused, choosing his words carefully. I don't presume to know God's mind, but I know that he is a God of mercy and justice, and I know that he struggled visibly. I know that the world we've built here, the system we've created, it's complicated. Complicated, Hannah repeated. That's one word for it. What I mean is, I've counseled many slaves over the years. I've heard their confessions, their fears, their anger, and I've always wondered. He looked down at his Bible, as if the leather binding held answers he couldn't find in his own heart. I've wondered if we've strayed from God's true intent, if the practices we defend, the bondage we enforce, if perhaps we've confused our comfort with God's will. This was dangerous talk from a white minister in Virginia in 1842. Hannah studied him with new interest. You having doubts, Reverend? I'm having questions, watching you these past days, hearing about your trial, about what led to your actions. It's forced me to question things I've long accepted. He met her eyes. You're to die tomorrow, and part of me wonders if the crime isn't yours alone, if perhaps we all share in it. Everyone who benefits from a system built on the suffering of others. Hannah leaned forward, gripping the bars of her cell. Then speak up. Tell them. Tell the judge. Tell the plantation owners. Tell everyone who will listen that this system is wrong. Cotton's face twisted with anguish. I'm one voice. What could I change? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But at least you'd have tried. At least you wouldn't be complicit in silence. They sat together for another hour, the minister and the condemned woman, talking about God and justice and the terrible gap between what people claimed to believe and what they actually practiced. When Cotton finally left, he pressed his Bible against the bars, offering it to Hannah. For comfort, he said. She took it, not because she needed the comfort of his God, but because the gesture was kind, and kindness was rare enough to be treasured. That final night, Hannah didn't sleep at all. She sat with her back against the stone wall, watching the window, waiting for dawn. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. She heard rats scurrying in the walls, heard another prisoner in a distant cell crying, heard the night watch changing, boots echoing on stone. And she thought about tomorrow. They would come for her at mid-morning. They would bind her hands and walk her through the streets of Louisa Courthouse, parading her before the assembled crowd. Plantation owners would come to watch. Their wives would attend, clutching their children close, using Hannah's execution as a teaching moment. This is what happens when you forget your place. The hanging would be public, a spectacle designed to terrify and control. She would climb the steps to the platform, feel the rough hemp of the noose placed around her neck, hear whatever final words the authorities deemed appropriate. Then the floor would drop and gravity would do its work. If she was lucky, her neck would break cleanly. If not, she would strangle slowly, dancing on air while the crowd watched. Hannah tried not to think about the mechanics of it, tried to focus instead on what it meant. Her death would be a message, yes, a warning to other slaves who might consider resistance. But it would also be a story, and stories had a way of escaping control, of being retold and reshaped, of becoming something their creators never intended. She thought about Mercy and Jacob, hoped they wouldn't be forced to witness the execution, hoped they would survive whatever came next, hoped that somehow, someday, they would understand why their mother had chosen violence over submission. Outside her cell window, the sky began to lighten. First a pale grey, then hints of pink and gold. Dawn was breaking on her last day. Hannah stood, stretching her cramped muscles, and faced the light. Whatever happened next, she would face it standing. The morning of June 18th, 1842, dawned clear and hot, the kind of Virginia summer day where the air itself felt liquid. By 9 o'clock, Louisa Courthouse's public square was already crowded with people who had come to witness justice, or vengeance, depending on how one chose to frame it. The gallows stood in the center of the square, a fresh-built wooden structure that smelled of new lumber and tar. It rose 15 feet high, impossible to ignore, a stark reminder of the state's power over life and death. The platform was large enough for 4 people to stand comfortably: the condemned, the sheriff, a minister if requested, and whoever would pull the lever that opened the trapdoor. Surrounding the gallows, a crowd gathered that numbered perhaps 300 people. Plantation owners arrived in carriages with their families, settling into chairs that had been arranged in a semicircle, like theatre seating for a grim performance. Common white folks stood in clusters, farmers and shopkeepers who had closed their businesses for the morning to attend, and around the edges, carefully separated by invisible but absolute boundaries, stood the slaves, brought by their masters to witness the lesson, to see what happened when one of their own forgot their place. Thomas Harrow sat in the front row of chairs, his face impassive. Beside him, an empty seat represented his wife, who remained at Rosewood, blind and bitter, unable to attend the execution she had essentially ordered. Near them sat the Caldwell family and other plantation aristocracy, dressed in their finest despite the heat, demonstrating their respectability, their unity, their shared commitment to maintaining order. At the jail 3 blocks away, Hannah was being prepared. The jailer, a man named Wilkins, who had grown surprisingly sympathetic over 3 days of guarding her, approached her cell with gentle movements. "It's time," he said quietly, unlocking the door. "They're ready for you." Hannah stood. She wore a simple white dress provided by the county. Tradition dictated that the condemned wear white, symbol of whatever purity might remain in a soul about to meet its maker. Her hair had been combed and pulled back. Her burned hands, still bandaged, rested at her sides. "Can I have a moment?" she asked. Wilkins nodded and stepped back, giving her privacy. Hannah closed her eyes and took 5 deep breaths, centering herself. She thought of Mercy. She thought of Jacob. She thought of every slave who would hear this story and maybe, just maybe, feel a spark of something that couldn't be whipped out of them. Then she opened her eyes and stepped out of her cell. They bound her hands in front of her, a small mercy, allowing her to maintain some dignity, and led her out into the morning sunlight. The walk to the gallows was 3 blocks through the center of town. Every step felt surreal, like moving through a dream where nothing was quite solid. People lined the streets. Some stared with open hostility. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the spectacle, even as they participated in it. Children peered from behind their parents' legs, eyes wide, with the fascination of youth encountering death for the first time. Hannah kept her head up, her gaze forward. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her broken. As they entered the square, a murmur ran through the assembled crowd. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The condemned woman, the slave who had dared to strike her mistress, walking toward her punishment. Some expected her to weep, to beg, to finally show the proper subservience that had been lacking in her crime. She did none of those things. Hannah walked steadily across the square, her white dress bright against the crowd's darker colors. She climbed the steps to the gallows platform, 13 steps, she counted them, and took her place at the center, where the noose hung waiting. Sheriff Robert Dandridge stood on the platform with her, a heavy-set man with a mustache that drooped in the heat. He held a piece of paper containing the official death warrant. Behind him, Reverend Cotton had positioned himself, Bible in hand, ready to offer final prayers. Dandridge cleared his throat and read from his paper in a voice loud enough to carry across the square. Hannah, slave property of Thomas Harrow, having been found guilty by a jury of her peers of the crime of malicious wounding and attempted murder, and having been sentenced to death by hanging, that sentence will now be carried out. Do you have any final words? This was tradition. The condemned were allowed to speak, to make peace with God, to apologize, to beg forgiveness. Most used it to proclaim their innocence or to plead for mercy that wouldn't come. Hannah looked out at the crowd. 300 faces stared back. She saw Thomas Harrow in the front row, his expression unreadable. She saw other plantation owners, their wives, their children. She saw slaves standing at the margins, some with tears streaming down their faces, others with expressions of barely contained rage. She saw her moment. "I got words," Hannah said, her voice carrying clear and strong across the square. "But not the words you expect." The crowd shifted, uncertain. Dandridge frowned, but didn't interrupt. This was her right, these final moments. "I'm not sorry," Hannah continued. "I know that's what you want to hear. You want me to repent, to cry, to beg forgiveness for what I done. But I won't lie. Not now. Not with my last breath. I did what I did because it needed doing, because my daughter was whipped until her back bled for the crime of breaking a dish, because 17 years of obedience and silence didn't protect her, didn't protect none of us." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Blasphemy!" but others shushed them, wanting to hear what this condemned woman would say. "You call this justice," Hannah went on, gesturing at the gallows, at the crowd, at the whole arrangement. "But justice would mean my daughter never got whipped in the first place. Justice would mean children don't grow up as property. Justice would mean I could protect my own without having to blind someone to do it." "That's enough," Dandridge said, placing a hand on her shoulder. But Hannah shook him off. "No, it ain't enough. It'll never be enough. You're going to hang me to prove a point, to keep everyone in line. Fine, do it. But know that every time you look at a slave from now on, you'll wonder. You'll wonder if they're thinking what I thought, if they're carrying the same rage, if one day they'll decide that dying on their feet is better than living on their knees." The square erupted. Some people shouted in anger, calling for her to be silenced, to be hung immediately without further ceremony. Others stood in shocked silence, confronted by words that named the fear they never acknowledged. And the slaves at the margins, they stood transfixed, watching a woman speak truths that they'd all felt but never dared voice. Thomas Harrow rose from his seat, his face flushed. "Enough of this. Sheriff, do your duty." Dandridge grabbed Hannah roughly, positioning her over the trapdoor. The hangman, a hooded figure who had stood silent at the platform's edge, stepped forward with the noose, but before he could place it around Hannah's neck, Reverend Cotton spoke up. "Wait." The minister's voice shook. "Please, just wait a moment." Everyone turned to stare at him. Cotton looked pale, his Bible clutched so tight his knuckles had gone white. He stared at Hannah, then at the crowd, then back at Hannah. "I can't do this," he said quietly, then louder. "I can't do this." "What?" Dandridge looked confused. "Reverend, your part is just to pray." "No." Cotton shook his head. "My part is to stand here and sanctify this, to give it God's blessing, to make everyone feel better about what we're doing. But I can't, because this woman," he pointed at Hannah, "this woman is right." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A minister contradicting an execution was unheard of. "She's right," Cotton repeated, his voice growing stronger. "We've built a system that treats human beings as property, that whips children for accidents, that denies mothers the right to protect their young, and we've wrapped it all in scripture and law and called it righteous. But it's not righteous. It's evil. It's the foulest evil, made worse because we do it with clear consciences." "Reverend Cotton, you're overwrought," Thomas Harrow said, standing. "This heat, the tension of the moment." "I'm not overwrought." Cotton's face was red now, whether from heat or emotion or both. "I'm finally seeing clearly. For years I've preached obedience to slaves, told them to accept their lot, promised them reward in heaven for suffering on earth. I've been complicit. We've all been complicit. And this woman," he turned to Hannah, "this woman had the courage to say no, to choose action over acceptance, and we're going to kill her for it." The crowd was in chaos now, people shouting over each other, some demanding Cotton be removed, others defending him, still others simply stunned into silence. Dandridge tried to restore order. "Reverend, I respect your crisis of conscience, but we have a legal execution to carry out. The law is unjust," Cotton shouted, "and an unjust law is no law at all." Hannah watched this unexpected turn with wonder. She hadn't expected her final words to spark this reaction, hadn't imagined that a white minister would risk his reputation and position to defend her. She caught Cotton's eye and nodded once, a gesture of gratitude. The minister saw it and nodded back, tears streaming down his face, but the machine of justice, once set in motion, was hard to stop. Dandridge gestured to two deputies who had been standing guard. "Remove the Reverend from the platform. We're proceeding." They grabbed Cotton, who didn't resist but continued shouting as they pulled him away. "This is murder. This is state-sanctioned murder, and all of you—" He swept his arm across the crowd. "All of you who watch and say nothing are as guilty as those who tie the noose." Then he was gone, dragged from the platform, still shouting scripture about justice and mercy in the year of Jubilee when all slaves were to be freed. His voice faded as they pulled him across the square, leaving behind a crowd thoroughly unsettled. Dandridge, shaken but determined, turned back to Hannah. The hangman approached again with the noose. This time, there would be no interruption. Hannah felt the rough hemp settle around her neck. It was coarser than she'd imagined, scratchy against her skin. The hangman tightened it, positioning the knot carefully behind her left ear, the placement that would, if done correctly, break her neck instantly upon the drop. "Any more words?" Dandridge asked, his voice tired. Hannah looked out at the crowd one last time. She found the section where the slaves stood and focused on them, on the faces of her people, and spoke directly to them. "Remember this," she said. "Remember that resistance is possible. Remember that you're human no matter what they call you. And remember my name, Hannah, not Hannah the slave, not Hannah the property, just Hannah. A woman who loved her children enough to fight back." Then she closed her eyes. Dandridge signaled. The hangman moved to the lever that would release the trapdoor. The crowd held its breath, the moment stretching like taffy, everything suspended between justice and murder, between law and atrocity. The lever pulled. The floor dropped. Hannah fell, and the rope went taut. Her neck broke cleanly. Death came quick, a mercy she hadn't expected. Her body swung slightly, turning in the morning breeze, and then was still. For a long moment, no one moved. 300 people stood frozen, confronted with the physical reality of what they'd demanded. A dead woman in a white dress, hanging from a rope, her crime being that she'd refused to accept her daughter's suffering in silence. Then, slowly, the crowd began to disperse. Some left quickly, uncomfortable, wanting to put distance between themselves and what they'd witnessed. Others lingered, talking in hushed tones, debating Cotton's outburst and Hannah's final words. And the slaves, brought to learn a lesson, stood longest of all, staring at the gallows, memorizing the sight, understanding that they were witnessing something that transcended the moment. Thomas Harrow approached the platform. He looked up at Hannah's body, at this woman who had destroyed his wife's beauty, and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no closure, just a profound emptiness. He had gotten his justice, his vengeance, his example made, so why did he feel like he'd lost something essential? "Cut her down," he ordered, "and bury her properly. She was still property. She deserves that much." But even as he said it, he knew how hollow it sounded. Property didn't speak like Hannah had spoken. Property didn't sacrifice themselves for love. Property didn't haunt your dreams with their words. They cut Hannah down an hour later and buried her in the slaves' cemetery outside town, in an unmarked grave. No ceremony, no marker, just earth and silence. But that night in slave quarters across 3 counties, people gathered in secret and spoke her name, told her story, added details, embellished some parts, made her larger than life. The woman who blinded her mistress became legend before the dirt on her grave had settled. And somewhere in the midst of that storytelling, in the hushed voices and awed retelling, Hannah became more than she'd been in life. She became a symbol, a reminder, a promise that resistance was possible even when it cost everything. Back at Rosewood Plantation, in a small cabin by the fields, Mercy lay on her mattress, her healing back pressed against rough cloth, and cried for a mother she would never see again. Jacob sat beside her, holding her hand, both children trying to understand a world that had taken everything from them. But in the midst of their grief, Mercy felt something else too, something she couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or recognition. Her mother had loved her enough to risk everything, had seen her suffering and refused to accept it, had chosen action over silence, even knowing it meant death. That was a kind of love Mercy had never fully understood before, a fierce, protective love that didn't calculate costs or weigh consequences, a love that said, "You are worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth burning the world for." And as Mercy lay there, listening to Jacob's quiet breathing, feeling the ache in her scarred back, she made herself a promise. She would survive. She would remember. And one day, when she had children of her own, she would tell them about their grandmother Hannah, who forgot to be a slave and paid the ultimate price. The story would live on, that much was certain. 3 years passed, 3 years of seasons cycling through rosewood plantation, cotton planted and harvested, tobacco cured and sold. The great machine of slavery grinding onward as if nothing had changed. But something had changed, in ways both visible and invisible, measurable and mysterious. Evelyn Harrow never recovered her sight. She lived in the main house still, moving through familiar rooms by memory, her burned face hidden behind veils when she ventured outside. The beauty that had defined her was gone, replaced by twisted scar tissue and empty eye sockets. But worse than the physical damage was the mental toll. She heard whispers everywhere, slaves talking behind her back, laughing at her, pitying her. She couldn't see their faces, couldn't read their expressions, and the uncertainty drove her to paranoia. She rarely left her room anymore, spent her days in darkness that matched her ruined eyes, while Thomas ran the plantation and quietly resented the woman his wife had become. The story of Hannah had spread far beyond Louisa County. It traveled along the underground networks of slave communication, carried by field hands sold to other plantations, by house servants who overheard their masters talking, by the mysterious ways that news traveled among people who weren't allowed to read or write, but who possessed sophisticated oral traditions. In Mississippi, they told the story of a woman who'd thrown firewater in her mistress's face and escaped into the swamps, never to be caught. In Georgia, the story became about a cook who poisoned an entire plantation family and disappeared into the night. In South Carolina, Hannah became a root woman who cursed her masters with blindness and lived in the woods, helping runaways find freedom. The details changed with each telling, but the core remained. A slave woman who had struck back, who had chosen violence over submission, who had paid the ultimate price but became something larger in death than she'd ever been in life. For the masters, Hannah's story was cautionary tale about the necessity of strict control, of never showing weakness, of crushing any hint of rebellion before it could spread. They told it to new overseers as a lesson in vigilance. They used it to justify harsher punishments, tighter restrictions, increased surveillance. But for the slaves, Hannah's story meant something entirely different. It meant that resistance was possible, that the masters were not invincible, that a single act of defiance, even one that ended in death, could echo through the years and inspire others. In 1845, 3 years after Hannah's execution, Mercy was 15 years old. She had been sold, as predicted, though by a stroke of fortune she and Jacob had been purchased together by a relatively benign master named Edmund Pierce, who owned a small farm near Richmond. Pierce was Quaker, quietly opposed to slavery, but trapped by economic necessity into owning human property. He treated his slaves with as much kindness as the system allowed, paid them small wages, and promised eventual manumission. It was in Pierce's household that Mercy learned to read. The Quaker family taught all their slaves to read the Bible, believing that spiritual education transcended racial lines. What started as scripture lessons expanded into broader literacy. Mercy proved an eager student, absorbing knowledge like drought-cracked earth drinking rain. She read everything she could find. Newspapers that Pierce left lying around, books in the family library, pamphlets from abolitionist societies that the Quakers quietly supported. And one evening, in the quiet of the small room she shared with Jacob, Mercy began to write. She wrote about her mother, about Hannah's life, her strength, her final act of defiance. She wrote about the day Mistress Harrow had ordered her whipped, about carrying the scars on her back, about watching her mother walk to the gallows with her head held high. The writing was rough, unpolished, full of errors in spelling and grammar. But it was real. It was her story, her mother's story, written in her own hand, a revolutionary act for a slave girl in 1845 Virginia. Pierce discovered the writing by accident one day while searching for a lost book. He found Mercy's papers hidden under her mattress and sat on her bed, reading by lamplight. What he found moved him to tears. That evening, he called Mercy to his study. "I read your writing," he said without preamble, "about your mother, About Hannah. Mercy's heart hammered. Writing was dangerous. Reading was dangerous. The wrong master would have her whipped for possessing such skills, such thoughts. But Pierce was different. She'd learned that in 2 years under his roof. "I'm sorry, sir. I know slaves ain't supposed to—" "Don't apologize." Pierce leaned forward in his chair. "Your mother's story. It's important. It deserves to be told, preserved." He paused, struggling with something. "Mercy, I've been corresponding with abolitionist groups in Philadelphia. Quakers, mostly. They publish narratives, slave narratives, stories written by those who have experienced bondage, telling the truth of what slavery really is." Mercy stared at him, not understanding where this was going. "Your mother's story, told in your words, it could be published. It could reach people throughout the North, maybe even in England. It could help the cause of abolition." The idea was staggering. Her words, printed in books, read by people she'd never meet. The story of Hannah reaching beyond Virginia, beyond the South, to places where slavery was already illegal. "But I'm not free," Mercy said quietly. "How can I publish anything when I'm still property?" Pierce nodded. "That's the difficulty. The narrative would need to be submitted anonymously or under a pseudonym, and there's risk. If your identity became known, if the wrong people traced it back to me—" He trailed off, but the implication was clear. He could lose his property, his farm, face legal prosecution for helping a slave publish abolitionist material. "Why would you risk that?" "Because your mother was right." Pierce's voice shook with conviction. "This system is evil. I participate in it because I lack the courage to fully resist, but I can do small things. I can help your story reach people who can make change. It's not enough, but it's something." Over the next year, working in secret, Mercy revised and expanded her writing with Pierce's help. They worked by candlelight after the household slept, Pierce correcting her grammar and spelling while carefully preserving her voice, her perspective, the raw truth of her experience. The narrative they produced was unlike most slave narratives of the era, which focused on dramatic escapes to freedom. Mercy's story had no triumphant ending. Her mother had died on the gallows. She and Jacob remained enslaved. There was no moral victory, no clear lesson, except the harsh reality of what slavery demanded, and what one mother had refused to give. In 1846, the narrative was published anonymously as a pamphlet by the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society under the title "The True History of Hannah, a Virginia Slave Who Chose Death Over Submission." 5,000 copies were printed. They spread throughout the North, were read aloud at abolitionist meetings, cited in speeches, passed hand to hand among those fighting to end slavery. The response was overwhelming. Some praised it as a powerful testament to the human cost of slavery. Others condemned it as incendiary, warning that it would inspire slave rebellions. Several southern states banned its possession, making it illegal to even own a copy. But the pamphlet continued to spread, often in secret, sometimes smuggled into the South by traveling abolitionists. Slaves who could read shared it with those who couldn't, reading aloud in hidden gatherings. The story of Hannah reached slave quarters in Alabama, Louisiana, Texas. It crossed the Atlantic, was translated into French and German, read in European parlors by aristocrats who debated the American peculiar institution. And everywhere it went, the story sparked something. Not rebellion. The plantation system was too powerful, too entrenched for a single story to topple. But awareness, recognition, the understanding that behind every passive, obedient slave might lurk the same rage that Hannah had carried, the same capacity for resistance. For masters throughout the South, the pamphlet became a source of anxiety. They saw it as dangerous propaganda, as a weapon more effective than any physical uprising. They couldn't hang a story, couldn't whip words into submission. The more they tried to suppress it, the more it spread. In 1850, 5 years after the pamphlet's publication, Mercy received her freedom. Edmund Pierce, terminally ill with consumption, manumitted all his slaves in his will, providing them with small plots of land and enough money to start independent lives. Mercy was 20 years old, free for the first time, and she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She moved to Philadelphia, to the heart of the abolitionist movement. There she began speaking publicly about her experiences, about her mother's story, about the reality of slavery from the perspective of someone who had lived it. She spoke in churches, at rallies, in private parlors where wealthy abolitionists gathered to discuss the cause. Her message was simple but powerful. Slavery was not some abstract political issue. It was mothers watching their children whipped. It was women choosing death over continued submission. It was the daily grinding destruction of human spirits in service to cotton and tobacco and sugar. And she always ended her speeches the same way. My mother's name was Hannah. She was not property. She was not a slave. She was a woman, a mother, a human being who loved her children enough to fight back. Remember her. Remember that resistance is possible. Remember that the chains can be broken, even if the cost is high. By 1852, Mercy's speeches were drawing crowds of hundreds. She became one of the few former slaves whose testimony regularly appeared in northern newspapers. Frederick Douglass himself invited her to speak at abolitionist gatherings. Harriet Beecher Stowe, working on a novel about slavery, sought Mercy out for details that would make her fictional characters feel real. But the speaking tours took their toll. Mercy's health, never robust after years of inadequate food and hard labor, began to fail. The scars on her back ached constantly. She developed a persistent cough that doctors couldn't cure. In 1854, at age 24, Mercy collapsed after a speech in Boston. She was taken to a Quaker hospital, where doctors diagnosed advanced consumption, the same disease that had killed Edmund Pierce. She had months to live, perhaps less. In those final months, Mercy wrote one last narrative. Not about her mother this time, but about herself. But what it meant to be the daughter of Hannah, to carry that legacy, to try to honor a sacrifice she still wasn't sure she understood. She wrote about freedom and its complexities, about how leaving slavery didn't erase its marks, about carrying the past like a weight you couldn't set down. The narrative was published posthumously in 1855, the same year Mercy died. She was buried in a Quaker cemetery in Philadelphia, her grave marked with a simple stone that read, "Mercy, daughter of Hannah, born in bondage, died in freedom, 1830–1855. Back in Virginia, in the slave quarters of Rosewood Plantation, people still whispered Hannah's name. The story had become legend now, embellished and mythologized. Some claimed Hannah's ghost walked the woods on summer nights, carrying a copper kettle, seeking vengeance on cruel masters. Others said she'd never really died, that the hanging had been faked, that she'd escaped to Canada and lived there in freedom. The truth was simpler and sadder. Hannah had died on the gallows in 1842, but her story had lived on, carried forward by her daughter and by countless others who saw in her act a reflection of their own suppressed rage, their own dreams of resistance. In 1859, when John Brown raided Harper's Ferry in an attempt to spark a slave rebellion, many of his followers knew Hannah's story. They cited it as inspiration, as proof that individual acts of defiance mattered, even when they seemed futile. In 1861, when the Civil War erupted and slaves throughout the South began fleeing to Union lines seeking freedom, many carried with them stories of resistance, and Hannah's story was among them. And in 1865, when the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States, when 4 million enslaved people became legally free, Hannah's story was still being told, still circulating, still serving as a reminder of what people would endure and what they would do when pushed beyond endurance. A century later, when historians began seriously studying slave resistance, they uncovered Mercy's pamphlets in archives. They found newspaper accounts of the trial. They pieced together the story of Hannah and her daughter, recognizing it as a crucial example of how individual acts of defiance contributed to the larger movement toward abolition. Hannah never became as famous as Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass. Her name didn't appear in textbooks. But among scholars of slavery and resistance, her story became legendary. The cook who chose violence over submission, who sacrificed everything to protect her daughter, who showed that even the most powerless could wield power in unexpected ways. And in certain circles, among descendants of slaves, among those who studied not just the famous figures, but the countless unnamed resistors, Hannah's story persisted. Mothers told it to daughters. Grandmothers whispered it to grandchildren. It became part of the oral tradition, the collective memory of a people who had survived impossible cruelty and found ways to resist, even when resistance seemed futile. The copper kettle became a symbol. The bathing room at Rosewood Plantation, long since abandoned after the Civil War destroyed the plantation system, was said to be haunted. Local people claimed to hear sounds of water boiling, to see steam rising from the old bathhouse on certain nights, to feel a presence there, angry, protective, still defending her children long after her death. Whether true or not, the story served a purpose. It reminded people that history was not just the record of great men and important battles. It was also the story of a mother in a kitchen, of a daughter receiving 20 lashes, of a decision made in the space between obedience and rebellion. And it raised questions that remained relevant long after slavery ended. What do you do when the law protects injustice, when authority demands submission to cruelty, when the only way to protect those you love is to become what society calls a criminal? Hannah had answered those questions with boiling water and a copper kettle. Her answer cost her everything, but it gave her daughter a story to tell, gave her people an example to remember, gave history one more proof that the human spirit, even when enslaved, never fully surrendered. On summer nights in Virginia, when the air hangs thick and storms roll across the hills, some say you can still hear it, the hiss of boiling water, the scream that echoed through Rosewood Plantation on that June evening in 1842. They say Hannah's ghost still walks, still seeks justice for the child who was whipped, still pours and pours and pours, water turned to weapon, love transformed to fury. The story calls it vengeance. But those who understand, those who know what it means to be powerless and desperate and pushed too far, they call it something else. They call it deliverance. And they remember Hannah.